All right, I am back. So this is a prophecy Reformation now hour covering history, a very important part of the Christian world that we live in. Jesus said he would build his church, and he has been building his church for 2,000 years. We have a revelation that foretold this church over the last 2,000 years, and we are almost at the end of it. Most of the prophecy in that book has been fulfilled. There are just a very few things that are clearly outlined for the future yet that have yet to happen. So we are getting close, people. But it is important to go over the history of the church to know where the church has been and what Christ has been doing, how he has fulfilled the revelation in the past that brings us up to the date. And if we know how Christ has fulfilled the revelation, then it can be revealed to us what must shortly come to pass, even in our day, because we know where we are in the prophecy. That's why knowing the history is so important. And we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We were going through the Hussite Wars. We were on book 3 of James A. Wiley's History of Protestantism. And we're in the last chapter. Book 3 is the John Hussite and the Hussite Wars. Though John Huss had nothing to do with the wars, they were subsequent upon his death. And we saw how that God moved mightily in almost supernatural protection of the Bohemian nation as it stood for the truth against the entire Roman Empire at that time under the head of the Vatican. Nothing in the history has repeated like that since then. So we left off here. I had begun this chapter, but having just got 2 paragraphs into it, I'm going to restart chapter 19 from the beginning. Chapter 19, last scenes of the Bohemian Reformation. The 2 parties, the Calixtines and the Taborites. The Compactata, accepted by the first, rejected by the second. War between the 2. Death of Procopius. Would the Bohemian Reformation have regenerated Christendom? Sigismund violates the Compactata. He dies. His character: George Podebrand, elected king. The Taborites, visited by Aeneas Sylvius. Their persecutions. A Taborite ordination. Multiplication of their congregations. The Bohemians were now divided into 2 strongly marked and widely separated parties, the Taborites and the Calixtines. This division had existed from the first, but it widened in proportion as the strain of their great struggle was relaxed. The party that retained most of the spirit of John Huss were the Taborites. With them, the defense of their religion was the first concern, that of their civil rights and privileges the second. The latter they deemed perfectly safe under the aegis of the former. The Calixtines, on the other hand, had become lukewarm so far as the struggle was one for religion. They thought that the rent between their country and Rome was unnecessarily wide, and their policy was now one of approximation. They had secured the cup, as they believed, not reflecting that they had got transubstantiation along with it. And now the conflict, they thought, should cease. To the party of the Calixtines belonged the chief magnates and most of the great cities, which threw the preponderance of opinion on the side of the Compactata. Into this scale was thrown also the influence of Roxana, the pastor of the Calixtines. He was tempted with the hope of a bishopric. Says Comenius, and used his influence both at Basel and Prague to further conciliation on terms more advantageous to Rome than honorable to the Bohemians. In this manner, says Comenius, they receded from the footsteps of Huss and returned to the camp of Antichrist. In judging of the conduct of the Bohemians at this crisis of their affairs, we are to bear in mind that the events narrated took place in the 15th century, that the points of difference between the two churches, so perfectly irreconcilable, had not yet been so clearly and sharply defined as they came to be by the great controversies of the century that followed. But the Bohemians, in accepting this settlement, stepped down from a position of unexampled grandeur. Their campaigns are amongst the most heroic and brilliant of the wars of the world. A little country and a little army, they nevertheless were at this hour triumphant over all the resources of Rome and all the armies of the empire. They had but to keep their ground and remain united, and take care that their patriotism, kindled at the altar, did not decline, and that there was no power in Europe that would have dared attack them. From the day that the Bohemian nation sat down on the Compactata, their prestige waned. They gained no more victories, and the tone of public feeling and the tide of national prosperity began to go back. The Calixtines accepted, and the Taborites rejected this arrangement. The consequence was the deplorable one of an appeal to arms by the two parties. Formerly they had never unsheathed the sword except against a common enemy, and to add new glory to the glory already acquired, but now, alas, divided by that power whose wiles have ever since been 100 times more formidable than her arms, Bohemian unsheathed the sword against Bohemian. The Calixtines were by much the larger party, including, as they did not, only the majority of those who had dissensions from Rome, but also all the Roman Catholics. The Taborites remained under the command of Procopius, who, although most desirous of composing the strife and letting his country have rest, would not accept of peace on terms which he held to be fatal to his nation's faith and liberty. Bohemia, he clearly saw, had entered on the descending path. Greater concessions and deeper humiliations were before it. The enemy before whom she had begun to humble herself would not be satisfied until he had left from her all she had won in the victorious field. Rather than witness this humiliation, Procopius betook himself once more to the field at the head of his armed Taborites. Bloody skirmishes marked the opening of the conflict. At last the two armies met on the plain of Lipan, 12 English miles from Prague, the 29th of May, 1434, and a great battle was fought. The day, fiercely contested on both sides, was going in favor of Procopius, when the general of his cavalry rode off the field with all under his command. This decided the action. Procopius, gathering round him the bravest of his soldiers, rushed into the thick of the foe, where he contended for a while against fearful odds, but at last sank, overpowered by numbers. With the fall of Procopius came the end of the Hussite wars. A consummate general, a skillful theologian, an accomplished scholar, and an incorruptible patriot, Procopius had upheld the cause of Bohemia so long as Bohemia was true to itself. Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini said of him that he fell weary with conquering rather than conquered. His death fulfilled the saying of the Emperor Sigismund, that the Bohemians could be overcome only by Bohemians. With him fell the cause of the Hussites. No effectual stand could the Taborites make after the loss of their great leader, and as regards the Calixtines, they riveted their chains by the same blow that struck down Procopius. Yet one hardly can wish that this great patriot had lived longer. The heroic days of Bohemia were numbered, and the evil days had come in which Procopius could take no pleasure. He had seen the Bohemians united and victorious. He had seen puissant kings and mighty armies fleeing before them. He had seen their arts, their literature, their husbandry, all flourishing, for the intellectual energy evoked by the war did not expend itself in the camp. It overflowed and nourished every interest of the nation. The University of Prague continued open, and its classrooms crowded all throughout that stormy period. The common schools of the country were equally active, and education was universally diffused. Aeneas Sylvius says that every woman among the Taborites was well acquainted with the Old and New Testaments, and unwilling as he was to see any good in the Hussites, he yet confesses that they had one merit, namely, the love of letters. It was not uncommon at that era to find tracts written by artisans discussing religious subjects and characterized by the elegance of their diction and the vigor of their thinking. All this Procopius had seen, but now Bohemia herself had dug the grave of her liberties in the Compactata. And when all that had made Bohemia dear to Procopius was about to be laid in the sepulchre, it was fitting that he, too, should be consigned to the tomb. One is compelled to ask, what would the result have been had the Bohemians maintained their ground? Would the Hussite Reformation have regenerated Christendom? We are disposed to say that it would not. It had in it no principle of sufficient power to move the conscience of mankind. The Bohemian Reformation had respect mainly to the corruptions of the Church of Rome, not those of doctrine, but those of administration. If the removal of these could have been effected, the Bohemians would have been content to accept Rome as a true and apostolic church. The Lutheran Reformation, on the other hand, had a first and main respect to the principle of corruption in the individual man. This awoke the conscience. How shall I, a lost sinner, obtain pardon and life eternal? This was the first question in the Reformation of Luther. It was because Rome could not lift off the burden from the conscience, and not simply because her administration was tyrannical and her clergy scandalous, that men were constrained to abandon her. It was a matter of life and death with them. They must flee from a society where, if they remained, they saw they should perish everlastingly. Had Huss and Jerome lived, the Bohemian Reformation might have worked itself into a deeper groove, but their death destroyed this hope. There arose after them no one of equal commanding talents and piety, and the Bohemian movement, instead of striking its roots deeper, came more and more to the surface. Its successes, in fact, might have been a misfortune to Christendom, inasmuch as, by giving it a reformed Romanism, it would have delayed for some centuries the advent of a purer movement. The death of Procopius, as we have already mentioned, considerably altered the position of affairs. With him died a large part of that energy and vitality which had invariably sustained the Bohemians in their resolute struggles with their military and ecclesiastical enemies, and this being so, the cause gradually pined away. The Emperor Sigismund was now permitted to mount the throne of Bohemia, but not until he had sworn to observe the Compactata and maintain the liberties of the nation, July 12, 1436. A feeble guarantee. The Bohemians could hardly expect that the man who had broken his pledge to Huss would fulfill his stipulations to them. In striking this bargain with the heretics, says Aeneas Sylvius, the emperor yielded to necessity, being desirous at any price of gaining the crown, that he might bring back his subjects to the true church. And so it turned out. For no sooner did the emperor feel himself firm in his seat than, forgetful of the Compactata, and his oath to observe it, he proceeded to restore the dominancy of the Church of Rome in Bohemia. This open treachery provoked a storm of indignation. The country was on the brink of war, and this calamity was averted only by the death of the emperor in 1437, within little more than a year after being acknowledged as king by the Bohemians. Born to empire, not devoid of natural parts, and endowed with not a few good qualities, Sigismund might have lived happily and reigned gloriously, but all his gifts were marred by a narrow bigotry which laid him at the feet of the priesthood. The stake of Huss cost him a 20 years' war. He wore out life in labors and perils. He never knew repose. He never tasted victory. He attempted much, but succeeded in nothing. He subdued rebellion by subtle arts and deceitful promises, content to win a momentary advantage at the cost of incurring a lasting disgrace. His grandfather, Henry VII, had exalted the fortunes of his house and the splendor of his empire by opposing the papal see. Sigismund lowered both by becoming its tool. His misfortunes thickened as his years advanced. He escaped a tragical end by a somewhat sudden death. No grateful nation mourned around his grave. There followed some checkered years. The first rent in Bohemian unity, the result of declension from the first vigor of the Bohemian faith, was never healed. The Calixtines soon began to discover that the Compactata was a delusion, and that it existed only on paper. Their monarchs refused to govern according to its provisions. To plead it as the charter of their rights was only to expose themselves to contempt. The Council of Basel, no doubt, had appended its seal to it, but the Pope refused to look at it, and ultimately annulled it. At length, during the minority of King Vladislav, George Podebrand, a Bohemian nobleman and head of the Calixtines, became regent of the kingdom, and by his great talents and upright administration gave a breathing space to his distracted nation. On the death of the young monarch, Podebrand was elected king. He now strove to make the Compactata a reality and revive the extinct rights and bring back the vanished prestige of Bohemia, but he found that the hour of opportunity had passed, and that the difficulties of the situation were greater than his strength could overcome. He fondly hoped that Aeneas Sylvius, who had now assumed the tiara under the title of Pius II, would be more compliant in the matter of the Compactata than his predecessor had been. As secretary to the Council of Basel, Aeneas Sylvius had drafted this document, and Podebrand believed that, as a matter of course, he would ratify as Pope what he had composed as secretary. He was doomed to disappointment. Pius II repudiated his own handiwork and launched excommunication against Podebrand, 1463, for attempting to govern on its principles. Aeneas' successor in the papal chair, Paul II, walked in his steps. He denounced the Compactata anew, anathematized Podebrand as an excommunicated heretic, whose reign could only be destructive to mankind, and published a crusade against him. In pursuance of the papal bull, a foreign army entered Bohemia, and it became again a theater of battles, sieges, and great bloodshed. Podebrand drove out the invaders, but he was not able to restore the internal peace of his nation. The monks had returned, and priestly machinations were continually fomenting party animosities. He retained possession of the throne, but his efforts were crippled, his life was threatened, and his reign continued to be full of distractions until its very close, in 1471. The remaining years of the century were passed in similar troubles, and after this, the history of Bohemia merges in the general stream of the Reformation. We turn for a few moments to the other branch of the Bohemian nation, the Taborites. They received from Sigismund, when he ascended the throne, that lenient treatment which a conqueror rarely denies to an enemy whom he despises. He gave them the city of Tabor, with certain lands around, permitting them the free exercise of their worship within their allotted territory, exacting in return only a small tribute. Here they practiced the arts and displayed the virtues of citizens, exchanging the sword for the plow. Their domain bloomed like a garden. The rich cultivation that covered their fields bore as conclusive testimony to their skill as husbandmen, as their victories had done to their courage as warriors. Once, when on a tour through Bohemia, Aeneas Sylvius came to their gates, and though this rascally people did not believe in transubstantiation, he preferred lodging amongst them for the night to sleeping in the open field, where, as he confesses, though the confession somewhat detracts from the merits of the action, he would have been exposed to robbers. They gave the future pope a most cordial welcome, and treated him with Slavonic hospitality. About the year 1455, the Taborites formed themselves into a distinct church under the name of the United Brethren. They looked around them. Error covered the earth. All societies needed to be purified, the Calixtines as well as the Romanists. The evil was irreversible, so they judged. Therefore they resolved to separate themselves from all other bodies and build up truth anew from the foundation. This step exposed them to the bitter enmity of both Calixtines and Roman Catholics. They now became the object of a murderous persecution, in which they suffered far more than they had done in common with their countrymen in the Hussite wars. Roxana, who until now had befriended them, suffered himself to be alienated from and even incensed against them, and Podebrad, their king, tarnished his fame as a patriotic and upright ruler by the cruel persecution which he directed against them. They were dispersed in the woods and mountains. They inhabited dens and caves, and in these abodes they were ever careful to prepare their meals by night, lest the ascending smoke should betray their lurking places. Gathering round the fires which they kindled in these subterranean retreats, in the cold of winter, they read the Word of God and united in social worship. At times when the snow lay deep, it was necessary to go abroad for provisions. They dragged a branch behind them on their return, to obliterate their footsteps and make it impossible for their enemies to track them to their hiding places. Were they alone of all the witnesses of truth left on the earth, or were there others, companions with them in the faith and patience of the kingdom of Jesus Christ? They sent messengers into various countries of Christendom to inquire secretly and bring them word again. These messengers returned to say that everywhere darkness covered the face of the earth, but that nevertheless here and there they found isolated confessors of the truth, a few in this city and a few in that, the object, like themselves, of persecution, and that amid the mountains of the Alps was an ancient church resting on the foundations of Scripture and protesting against the idolatrous corruptions of Rome. This intelligence gave great joy to the Taborites. They opened a correspondence with these confessors, and were much cheered by finding that this Alpine church agreed with their own in the articles of its creed, the form of its ordination, and the ceremonies of its worship. The question of ordination occasioned the Taborites no little perplexity. They had left the Roman Church. They had no bishop in their ranks. How were they to perpetuate that succession of pastors which Christ had appointed in his church? After many anxious deliberations, for their minds were harassed, says Comenius, with the fear that the ordination of presbyter by presbyter would not be held valid, they proceeded according to the following somewhat novel fashion. In the year 1467, their chief men, to the number of about 70, out of all Bohemia and Moravia, met in a plain called Lahoda, in the neighborhood of the town of Rich Novia. Humbling themselves with many tears and prayers before God, they resolved upon an appeal by lot to the divine omniscience as to who should be set over them as pastors. They selected by suffrage 9 men from among themselves, from whom 3 were to be chosen to be ordained. They then put the 12 schedules or voting papers in the hands of a boy who was kept ignorant of the matter, and they ordered him to distribute these schedules among the 9 persons already selected. Of the 12 voting papers, 9 were blanks, and 3 were inscribed with the word, "It is the will of God." The boy distributed the schedules, and it was found that the 3 bearing the word had been given to the 3 following persons: Matthew Conwaldius, one of the most pious men; Thomas Preslausius, a very learned man; and Elias Cresenovius, who was distinguished for his great parts. They received ordination by the imposition of hands from a body of Waldensian pastors, including whom Comenius styles bishops, and one of whom, Stephen, soon thereafter suffered martyrdom at the stake in Vienna. The death of Podobrad and the accession of the Polish prince Vladislav in 1471 brought them deliverance from persecution. The quiet they now enjoyed was followed by an increase in the number of their congregations. Their lot was cast in evil days, but they knew that the appointed years of darkness must be fulfilled. They remembered the words first uttered by Huss and repeated by Jerome, that a century must revolve before the day should break. These were to the Taborites what the words of Joseph were to the tribes in the house of bondage: "I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out." The prediction kept alive their hopes in the night of their persecution, and in the darkest hour their eyes were still turned toward the horizon like men who watch for the morning. Year passed after year. The end of the century arrived. It found 200 churches of the United Brethren in Bohemia and Moravia. So goodly was the remnant which, escaping the destructive fury of fire and sword, was permitted to see the dawning of that day which Huss had foretold. And that is the end of Book 3, John Huss and the Hussite Wars. And we're moving on to Book 4, Christendom at the Opening of the 16th Century. Chapter 1, Protestantism and Medievalism. Ancient society discarded. New races brought on the stage. Their capacity for progress. The Reformation not possible before the 16th century. Medievalism revives. A conflict. Odds. The victory of the weak. We are now arrived at the 16th century. For 1,000 years the great ruler had been laying, in the midst of wars and great ethical revolutions, the foundations of a new and more glorious edifice than any former age had seen. Ancient society was too enfeebled by slavery and too corrupted by polytheism to be able to bear the weight of the structure about to be erected. The experiment had been tried of rearing the new social edifice upon the old foundation, but the attempt had turned out a failure. By the 4th century, the gospel, so warmly embraced at first by the Greek and Roman nations, had begun to decline, had in fact become greatly corrupted. It was seen that these ancient races were unable to advance to the full manhood of Christianity and civilization. They were continually turning back to old models and established precedents. They lacked capacity of adapting themselves to new forms of life and surrendering themselves to the guidance of great principles. What was to be done? Must the building which God purposed to erect be abandoned because a foundation sufficiently strong and sound could not be found for it? Should Christianity remain the half-finished structure, or rather the defaced ruin which the 4th and 5th centuries beheld it? An answer was given to this question when the gates of the north were open, and new hardy races, issuing from the obscure regions of Germany, spread themselves over southern and western Europe. An invisible power marched before these tribes and placed the earth, the Huns, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, and the Lombards, in that quarter of Christendom which best suited the part each was destined to play in that great drama of which the stamping out of the laws, the religion, and the government of the Old World was the first act. The same power which guided their march from the remote lands of their birth, and chose for them their several habitations, continued to watch over the development of their manners, the formation of their language, and the growth of their literature, and their art, and their laws, and their government, and thus, in the slow course of the centuries, were laid firm and broad the foundations of a new order of things. These tribes had no past to look back upon. They had no storied traditions and observances which they trembled to break through. There was no spell upon them like that which operated so mischievously upon the Greek and Latin races. They were free to enter the new path. Daring, adventurous, and liberty-loving, we can trace their steady advance step by step through the convulsions of the 10th century, the intellectual awakening of the 12th, and the literary revival of the 15th, onward to the great spiritual movement of the 16th. At this great moral epoch that we are now arrived, it will aid us if we pause in our narrative and glance for a moment at the constitution of Europe, and note especially the spirit of its policy, the play of its ambitions, and the crisis to which matters were fast tending at the opening of the 16th century. This will enable us to understand what we may term the timing of the Reformation. We have just seen that this great movement was not possible before the century we speak of, for until then there was no stable basis for it in the condition of the Teutonic nations. The rapid survey that is to follow will show us further that this renewal of society could not, without the most disastrous consequences to the world, have been longer delayed. Had the advent of Protestantism been postponed for a century or two beyond its actual date, not only would all the preparations of the previous ages have miscarried, but the world would have been overtaken, and society, it may be, dissolved a second time by a tremendous evil, which had been growing for some time and had now come to a head. Without the Protestantism of the 16th century, not only would the intellectual awakening of the 12th and the literary revival of the 15th century have been in vain, but the mental torpor, and it may be the religion also, of the Turk would at this day have been reigning in Europe. Christendom, at the epoch of which we speak, had only two things in its choice: to accept the gospel and fight its way through scaffolds and stakes to the liberty which the gospel brings with it, or to crouch down beneath the shadow of a universal Spanish monarchy, to be succeeded in no long time by the yet gloomier night of Moslem despotism. It would require more space than is here at our disposal to pass in review the several kingdoms of Europe, and note the transformation which all of them underwent as the era of Protestantism approached. Nor is this necessary. The characteristics of the Christendom of that age lay in two things: first, in the constitution and power of the empire, and secondly, in the organization and supremacy of the papacy. For certain ends, and within certain limits, each separate state of Europe was independent. It could pursue its own way, make war with whom it had in mind, or conclude a peace when it chose. But beyond these limits, each state was simply the member of a corporate body, which was under the sway of a double directorate. First came the empire, which in the days of Charlemagne, and again in the days of Charles V, assumed the presidency of nearly the whole of Europe. Above the empire was the papacy, wielding a subtler influence and armed with higher sanctions. It was the master of the empire in even a greater degree than the empire was the master of Europe. It is instructive to mark that, at the moment when the Protestant principle was about to appear, medievalism stood up in a power and grandeur unknown to it for ages. The former was at its weakest. The latter had attained its full strength when the battle between them was joined. To see how great the odds, what an array of force medievalism had at its service, and to be able to guess what would have been the future of Christendom and the world, had not Protestantism come at this crisis to withstand, nay, to vanquish the frightful combination of power that menaced the liberties of mankind, and to feel how marvelous in every point of view was the victory which, on the side of the weaker power, crowned this great contest, we must turn first to the empire. Chapter 2. The Empire. Fall of ancient empire. Revived by the Pope. Charlemagne. The Golden Bull. The 7 electors. Rules and forms of election. Ceremony of coronation. Insignia. Coronation feast. Emperor's power limited. Charles V. Capitulation. Spain. Becomes one monarchy on the approach of the Reformation. Its power increased by the discoveries of Columbus. Brilliant assemblage of states under Charles V. Liberty in danger. Protestantism comes to save it. One of the great empires of ancient Rome was, in the days of Valentinian, AD 364, divided into 2, the Eastern and the Western. The Turk eventually made himself heir to the Eastern Empire, taking forcible possession of it by his great guns and savage but warlike hordes. The Western Empire had dragged out a shadowy existence to our own day. There was, it is true, a parenthesis in its life. It succumbed to the Gothic invasion, and for a while remained in abeyance. But the Pope raised up the fallen fabric. The genius and martial spirit of the Caesars, which had created this empire at the first, the Pope could not revive, but the name and forms of the defunct government he could and did resuscitate. He grouped the kingdoms of Western Europe into a body or federation, and selecting one of their kings, he set him over the confederated states with the title of emperor. This empire was a fictitious or nominal one. It was the image or likeness of the past reflecting itself on the face of modern Europe. The empire dazzled the age which witnessed its sudden erection. The constructive genius and the marvelous legislative and administrative powers of Charlemagne, its first head, succeeded in giving it a show of power. But it was impossible by a mere fiat to plant those elements of cohesion and those sentiments of homage to law and order which alone could guarantee its efficiency and permanency. It supposed an advance of society and a knowledge on the part of mankind of their rights and duties, which was far from being the fact. The empire of the Germans, says the historian Midler, was constituted in a most extraordinary manner. It was a federal republic, but its members were so diverse with regard to form, character, and power that it was extremely difficult to introduce universal laws or to unite the whole nation in measures of mutual interest. The Golden Bull, says Tillers, that strange monument of the 14th century, fixed, it is true, a few relations of the head with the members, but nothing could be more indistinct than the public law of all those states, independent though at the same time united. Had not the Turks at that time, the violent enemies of all Christendom, come during the first years of the reign of Frederick to plant the crescent in Europe and menaced incessantly the empire with invasion, it is not easy to see how the feeble tie which bound that body together could have remained unbroken. The terror inspired by Mohammed too, and his ferocious soldiers, was the first common interest which led the princes of Germany to unite themselves to one another and around the imperial throne. The author last quoted makes mention of the Golden Bull. Let us bestow a glance on this ancient and curious document. It will bring before us the image of the time. Its author was Charles IV, Emperor and King of Bohemia. Pope Gregory, about the year 997, it is believed, instituted the 7 electors. Of these, 3 were churchmen and 3 were lay princes, and 1 of kingly rank was added to make up the mystic number of 7, as some have thought, but more probably to prevent equality of votes. The 3 churchmen were the Archbishop of Treves, Chancellor for France, the Archbishop of Mainz, Chancellor for Germany, and the Archbishop of Cologne, Chancellor for Italy. The 4 laymen were the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Marquis of Brandenburg. The Archbishop of Mainz, by letters patent, was to fix the day of election, which was to take place not later than 3 months from the death of the former emperor. Should the archbishop fail to summon the electors, they were to meet notwithstanding within the appointed time and elect one to the imperial dignity. The electors were to afford to each other free passage and safe conduct through their territories when on their way to the discharge of their electoral duties. If an elector could not come in person, he might send a deputy. The election was to take place in Frankfurt on the Main. No elector was to be permitted to enter the city attended by more than 200 horsemen, whereof 50 only were to be armed. The citizens of Frankfurt were made responsible for the safety of the electors under the penalty of loss of goods and privileges. The morning after their arrival, the electors, attired in their official habits, proceeded on horseback from the council hall to the cathedral church of St. Bartholomew, where Mass was sung. Then the Archbishop of Mainz administered an oath at the altar to each elector that he would be without bribe or reward, choose a temporal head for Christendom. Thereafter they met in secret conclave. Their decision must be come to within 30 days, but if deferred beyond that period, they were to be fed on bread and water, and prevented leaving the city until they had completed the election. Sounds familiar, does it not? A vessel of votes constituted a valid election, and the decision was to be announced from a stage erected for the purpose in front of the choir of the cathedral. The person chosen to the imperial dignity took an oath to maintain the profession of the Catholic faith, to protect the Church in all her rights, to be obedient to the Pope, to administer justice, and to conserve all the customs and privileges of the electors and states of the empire. The imperial insignia were then given to him, constituting of a golden crown, a scepter, a globe called the imperial apple, the sword of Charlemagne, a copy of the Gospels said to have been found in his grave, and a rich mantle which was presented to one of the emperors by an Arabian prince. The ceremonies enjoined by the Golden Bull to be observed at the coronation feast are curious. The following minute and graphic account of them is given by an old traveler. In solemn court the emperor shall sit on his throne, and the Duke of Saxony, laying a heap of oats as high as his horse's saddle before the court's gate, shall, with a silver measure of 12 marks price, deliver oats to the chief equerry of the stable, and then sticking his staff in the oats, shall depart, and the vice-marshal shall distribute the rest of the oats. The 3 archbishops shall say grace at the emperor's table, and he of them who is chancellor of the place shall lay reverently the seals before the emperor, which the emperor shall restore to him, and the staff of the chancellor shall be worth 12 marks of silver. The Marquis of Brandenburg, sitting upon his horse with a silver basin of 12 marks weight, and a towel, shall alight from his horse and give water to the emperor. The Count Palatine, sitting upon his horse with 4 dishes of silver with meat, each dish worth 3 marks, shall alight and set the dishes on the table. The King of Bohemia, sitting upon his horse with a silver cup worth 12 marks, filled with water and wine, shall alight and give it the emperor to drink. The gentleman of Falkenstein, under Chamberlain, the gentleman of his Teutoburg, master of the kitchen, and gentleman of Limburg, vice butler, or in their absence the ordinary officers of the court, shall have the said horses, basin, dishes, cup, staff, and measure, and shall after wait at the emperor's table. The emperor's table shall be 6 feet higher than any other table, where he shall sit alone, and the table of the empress shall be by his side 3 feet lower. The elector's table shall be 3 feet lower than that of the empress, and all of equal height, and 3 of them shall be on the emperor's right hand, and 3 on his left hand, and 1 before his face, and each shall sit alone at his table. When one elector has done his office, he shall go and stand at his own table, and so in order of the rest, until all have performed their offices, and then all 7 shall sit down at one time. And here we are running out of time. Speaking of time, this elaborate ceremony, the Golden Bull. You can see why people use slang, BS, bull. That's where it comes from, because words and decrees from the papacy were called bulls. I remember, and we will see that Martin Luther burns some bulls that he receives from the papacy, and discovers that, yes, that the seat of the Antichrist, or the man of sin, is actually the papal chair. Well, I've run out of time, and we're going to pick up right here next time in the 16th century of the history of Protestantism and of Christ building his church. May the Almighty bless you all and keep you all, and make sure you stay on the narrow way that leads to life. Yes, repentance road, where all God's people travel or sojourn through their mortal existence until he comes again. I love you all. I'll see you all next time.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at lulu.com and Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.